Mnangagwa himself is named in this report as being one of the bosses who ran lucrative cartels in a wide range of commodities at the expense of the average Zimbabwean. For details on this now, let's bring in Maverick Citizen Chief Editor, that's Mark Heywood, as well as lawyer and member of the MDC in Zimbabwe, Fadzayi Mahere. To both our guests, thanks so much for your time and welcome to the program. Mark, let's start with the issues around this report before we dive straight in. It couldn't be published in Zimbabwe because activists there quite literally fear for their lives. And my understanding is that the details were then sent to you and you went ahead and published it here in South Africa. Journalistically speaking, you must have undergone some kind of process to verify the authenticity of the damning findings that it makes.
Good morning, and thank you for having this discussion. Yes, if you look at what is happening in Zimbabwe in recent months and recent years, people who speak out about corruption, journalists and activists, very often are locked up. Fadzayi herself has had that recent experience. In worst cases, they are abducted and sometimes tortured. So although it is possible to speak in Zimbabwe, there is a price and there's a risk that is associated with it. And that was the basis on which I was approached by the authors of this report and asked to look at it and whether we would publish it in South Africa in the interests of transparency and in the interests of the global struggle against corruption, and obviously in the interests of people in Zimbabwe. We have to have very rigorous editorial standards, and the report was independently fact-checked by somebody. If you look at the report, you see it has something like 400 different references, so there's lots of clues to where the evidence is to be found in this report. But yes, I am confident of the truth of this report. And I should also say that whilst this report is making waves and must make waves, many of the allegations that are contained in the report are in the public domain already. What the report does, which I think is slightly different, is it joins them together in a picture of what I call the total anatomy of state capture, the collusion between senior people in government, including the president, senior people in business, and people in state-owned enterprises. So yes, that was the background to this report.
Right. It does paint a picture that I feel many people had probably not wanted to reckon with, considering, as you rightly alluded to, what we know about what takes place in Zimbabwe. But to what extent is South Africa complicit here? Because, of course, for some of these cartels to take place, many of the transactions are offshore, et cetera, which means there must be nations outside Zimbabwe that actually aid and abet this corruption.
Well, again, this is a reason I think it's in South Africa's public interest to publish this report as well, because we are very complicit in the crisis of Zimbabwe. There are two specific ways in which I believe we are complicit. One is that much of the tobacco that is smuggled out of Zimbabwe, the gold and the diamonds on which taxes are avoided, which are sold at a low price and churned and then resold at a higher price, comes to business people and middlemen in South Africa with Zimbabwean connections. So South Africa needs to tighten up its own oversight of smuggling, of tax evasion, of illicit financial transactions to stop that. And we know the names of the people. The report names the people and the businesses that are involved in this. But the second obvious reason is that, sadly, our government has cozied up to ZANU-PF for at least the last 2 decades and has turned a blind eye to both its omissions but also its crimes. And by doing so has allowed that regime to perpetuate itself and for this type of state capture to get more and more sophisticated to the point where it exists today. We have to say, and I'm sure Fadzayi will point this out, terrible, terrible, terrible cost to the ordinary citizens of Zimbabwe who are suffering without jobs, without healthcare services, without food, and without water.
Absolutely. And it's probably a good time to bring in Fadzayi. Thanks for your time as well. I mean, you can reflect on what Mark has said, but I was also hoping to engage you as an attorney with an understanding of how legalese actually works. My understanding is that there's actually an anti-corruption commission in Zimbabwe. There's meant to be an independent judiciary, but those bodies are not working the ways through which they should, which then begs the question, can a report like this actually change anything in Zimbabwe?
Well, thank you very much. Just constitutionally speaking, under Section 255 of our Constitution, we've got a Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, which has a mandate and a duty at law to expose and investigate cases of corruption. What's deeply concerning for the main opposition, for lawyers and for citizens in Zimbabwe is that a lot of the information and the corruption scandals that are referenced in the state capture report published by the Daily Maverick are scandals that have been in the public domain for some time. And yet we see this complete inaction by the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission. What's even more concerning is that there is this elite angle to the state capture. So you've got government officials all the way to the very top that are named in this state capture report, which creates a huge problem because a lot of our institutions aren't operating as strongly as we'd expect. For example, the National Prosecuting Authority, which has a duty to be impartial, which has a duty to investigate or to bring prosecution against those who are responsible for criminal offences, has been completely moribund. And Mr. Mnangagwa's anti-corruption fight has been used as a weapon to attack political enemies, as opposed to a genuine, sincere tool to bring those who are responsible for corruption to account, which is why we haven't seen any high-level convictions. This is against a backdrop where Zimbabwe loses over $3 billion United States dollars to corruption every single year. 1.5 billion is lost to illicit gold transactions every single year. And at the same time, 67% of Zimbabweans are living in extreme poverty. So what you can see quite clearly is that Zimbabwe is not poor, it's poorly managed. And we've got this huge albatross around our neck, which is a corrupt, violent dictatorship, which is looting the country to high heaven and is not putting the people first. Yeah. So all Zimbabweans and citizens are doing as much as they can to fight the scourge of corruption, and we're using the information in the state capture report to do that.
And the similarities,
obviously very difficult.
Sure, the similarities between state capture and Zimbabwe, state capture in Zimbabwe and state capture in South Africa are so clear, and I'm sure our audience is following those connections. But I just want to read an aspect from the report and get your thoughts on it, Fadzayi. So there's an aspect that says the findings show that when a patron loses control of the state, most cartels that have emerged from collusion tend to survive that patron's fall. In layman's terms, changing the figureheads in the government doesn't seem to matter, which suggests to me it's the system in its totality that needs to change. That considered, does it make sense to keep asking for an election, for instance, when quite frankly, there needs to be a complete overhaul of the system?
So, what we say as the main opposition, and what I'll say, frankly, as an advocate who practices in constitutional law, we have to be true to the Constitution. The Constitution creates institutions. The Constitution sets out timelines, sets out safeguards and values that must be respected. We cannot abandon the Constitution and, for example, say we won't have elections. What's required in Zimbabwe is deep institutional, political, and economic reform. The reason why Zimbabwe is where it is because the system, as you rightly point out, has failed. In 2017, when there was a coup against President Robert Mugabe and Mr. Mnangagwa came into power, the big mistake that Zimbabweans made is that we, did not follow the Constitution to a T. And we thought that the mere change of faces would bring about change and transformation to our lives. But the reality of the governance situation on the ground is that ZANU-PF has created a complete system of and it brings together all sorts of things. Corruption, looting, and patronage is one piece, but also to remain in power, they use violence, repression, abuse of human rights. They stifle free speech. They abduct those who speak out against their, the poverty they've created, the injustice, and the corruption. So, of course, we need elections, but prior to the holding of elections, what we need is, a clear raft, a massive overhaul of reforms, time-bound, that are properly, underwritten, and that can really set the stage for a proper, democratic, legitimate election in Zimbabwe, and also the depoliticization of our institution, removing the military from the civilian space, ensuring that we've got an independent judiciary and that the law is not weaponized to silence, dissent. We have to have a situation where our economy is detangled. Our Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe is taken out of the jaws of those who captured the state. All those reforms, we need reforms to our constitutional commissions, our anti-corruption commission, our human rights commission. We need reform of the National Prosecution Authority. That's what needs to be done. Zimbabwe has got an extremely progressive constitution, and yet we've got a regime that refuses to exercise political will in upholding the clear tenets of that constitution. As we speak, Mr. Mnangagwa's government is trying to amend the constitution instead of aligning laws to it. That's what we mean when we say that, Zimbabwe needs deep institutional, political, and economic reform.
Absolutely. Never enough time to fully ventilate these issues. But thanks for giving us a taste of what we ought to be looking out for and the questions to be asked. I really appreciate your time. Maverick Citizen Chief Editor Mark Heywood joining us there, as well as lawyer and member of the main opposition in Zimbabwe, the MDC, Fadzayi Mahere. To both of you, thank you once again.